I was reminded the other day by Al Goodman, the Mississippi State floodplain manager, that major flood disasters have often led to changes in the law. For example, Hurricane Agnes in 1972 resulted in the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973. Flooding on the Mississippi River in 1993 prompted the National Flood Insurance Reform Act of 1994. The Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2004 was influenced by hurricanes Andrew and Isabel. Unfortunately, 5 years after Hurricane Katrina, that major event has not prompted a reform in the law, and I would submit to this committee that in order to talk about hurricane insurance, we have to talk about wind and water insurance. One of the best things Congress could do for the vast coastal areas of this country, not just my state of Mississippi, but all of the Gulf Coast states, including states represented on this panel, is to resolve the nuances associated with insuring against hurricanes, and that involves insuring against flood and wind. For all practical purposes, private insurance coverage for wind damage is no longer available in the Gulf Coast area since Hurricane Katrina. Before the storm, the wind peril was typically insured by basic hazard insurance policies, with the exception of those living right on the beach. Today, in most of coastal Mississippi, individuals have to purchase wind coverage through the state-run wind pool. State wind pools were originally designed to be the insurer of last resort. However, in recent years, state wind pools have unfortunately become the rule, not the exception. Now, as you know, in 2008, I attempted to address this problem by offering an amendment that would have added wind coverage to the National Flood Insurance Program on a voluntary and actuarially sound basis. This multi-peril concept had passed the House of Representatives but failed in the Senate. I would simply point out to my colleagues, I still support the multiple peril debate, although I understand the arguments against it. Let me emphasize that it would be voluntary and that the requirement would be that it be actuarially sound. If that resulted in the wind portion of the premiums being too high, then so be it. But that was what my amendment contained. The major concern we have in Mississippi is that it takes two kinds of insurance to cover a hurricane: flood insurance through the NFIP and very expensive wind insurance through either the wind pool or, if you can get it, private coverage. After Hurricane Katrina, many property owners were forced to go to court to decide who was responsible for the damage, wind or water, even if they had all of the necessary insurance policies. Other property owners had not purchased flood insurance because they relied on Federal zone maps. When their property was damaged by storm, the wind insurance adjusters denied claims, ruling that the damage had been caused by water alone. Now, I recently introduced the Coordination of Wind and Flood Perils Act. This legislation, S. 3672, addresses some of the lessons learned following the wind versus water dispute that occurred after Katrina. Individuals who had all of the appropriate insurance, wind and water policies, were in many instances caught in the middle and forced to go to court to watch the insurers fight among themselves before they could be indemnified for their loss. The legislation I have introduced, S. 3672, would remove the property owner from this debate and put the burden where it belongs, on the insurers. The insurance industry already coordinates benefits for other types of losses. If there is a dispute under my legislation, the damages would be split evenly between the insurers, so the property owner would be compensated in a timely manner. Then the insurers would appear before an arbitration panel, and the panel's decision would be binding. Now, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, there are a few other lessons learned from Katrina and observations I would like to make about NFIP. Number one, after Hurricane Katrina, we learned that flood hazard risk in many coastal areas of Mississippi and many parts of the country was not accurately reflected by FEMA's flood insurance maps. As a result, property owners outside the flood zones had no NFIP coverage. With only wind insurance coverage, these individuals were not properly insured for a hurricane. Since property owners rely heavily on this information, I hope Congress can work with FEMA to ensure that these maps are accurately updated for all residents. Number two, FEMA and many banks do a poor job of enforcing the flood insurance requirement. Now, we've had testimony about this from Senator Schumer today, but under the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973, the purchase of flood insurance is mandatory in flood zones if the consumer is using a federally regulated lender. However, there is a breakdown with the enforcement of this requirement. According to CRS, at least 8 federal agencies are responsible for enforcing this requirement. Recently, the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania surveyed insurance coverage among property owners impacted by a flood in Vermont. The study revealed that 45% of the victims of the flood who were required to have insurance did not purchase it. With regard to private insurance, lenders do a much better job of enforcing insurance requirements. If a homeowner stops his payment, stops paying his premium, the bank will purchase insurance for him and bill the homeowner. The chair himself today has pointed out that some 50% of the people who are required to have flood insurance somehow do not have flood insurance. The Wharton study documents this too. Regulators and lenders routinely fail to enforce the mandate enacted in the Flood Disaster Protection Act. I hope the committee will further investigate this issue and report its findings. Why are hazard insurance requirements enforced so well by lenders and the flood insurance requirement enforced so poorly? Of course, rates should be actuarially sound and meaningful. Premium reductions should be offered for mitigation improvements. I hope this committee will study the work done by the Wharton School in this area. These scholars propose linking NFIP policy to the mortgage, which would create a long-term insurance policy tied to the length of the mortgage and to the property itself. Having a long-term policy tied to the property is one way to limit NFIP cancellations. This proposal would also give meaningful premium reductions for mitigation improvements. If a property owner knows they can save money year after year by strengthening their homes above the building code requirements, they will have a powerful incentive to do so. One final proposal that I would commend to this committee is the Travelers Coastal Wind Zone Plan. This proposal would create an independent federal commission to establish standards for the wind peril in coastal areas. The Travelers Plan allows insurance companies to purchase reinsurance from the federal government to cover losses resulting from extreme events. In addition, like the Wharton Plan, the Travelers Plan calls for meaningful premium reductions for property owners who mitigate by improving their homes. I would simply summarize and say this, Mr. Chairman. There are many things here that are long-term that are going to take time. Two things ought to be fairly easy. There ought to be a way to figure out how to enforce the mandate for property insurance, and there ought to be a way to allow insurers to coordinate benefits. Those are two simple things that could be done relatively quickly, perhaps before the end of the year. Earlier this year, the Sun-Herald, a Mississippi Coast newspaper, wrote in an editorial, "Better protection for all Americans living within harm's way of a hurricane would be Katrina's greatest legacy." I agree. 5 years after Katrina, Congress still has an opportunity to make sure affordable wind and water coverage can be provided to the millions of Americans in coastal areas of our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wicker, very, very much. And let me thank you, Senator Durbin, as well. I don't know if any of my colleagues have any questions for our two colleagues here. If not, we appreciate very much your testimony. Dick, I